Welcome everybody to this session on policies and governance on new mobility and MaaS. Before we start, I would like to share some short housekeeping rules. It was also announced in the plenary, but in case you missed that. If you look at the layout of the Hopin platform, you can submit your answers in the polls questions. We might be doing some after the presentations. In the People's tab, you can see who is attending the session, and we would like you to put all your questions in the Q&A area so we can take that in after the presentations. We will not actively use the chat session, but if you want to leave any comments, feel free. And if you want to hide the chat and this whole section, you can do that via this button or maximize your screen with this button. And after the session, there are more ways to see what's going on in the sessions with networking and also in the event chat, the People's tab and the Q&A tab. And if you want to reach out to somebody, you can also use the direct messaging button. So what's relevant for this session is that we would like you to put your questions in the Q&A, which is here, and that if we are going to use a poll, I will announce that, then you would need to scroll to this button. So we are going to start, and I'd like to invite the speakers to the stage. So you also have a face with a name. There's Nico and Stijn. And now we hope Martin is here. Yes, there we are. So in today's session, we have three speakers. Nico Larco from the Urbanism Next Center and Strategic Advisor at TNO. Stijn Vernaillen, who is at the City of Antwerp, how he calls himself the MaaS expert, very well connected to the MaaS program in Antwerp. And Martin Guit, who's a strategic advisor in the sector of mobility at the City of Rotterdam. And my name is Geiske Bouma. I am a senior in urban innovation and spatial planning at the organization of TNO in the Netherlands. So welcome to you all. I will do a short introduction, so I'll ask the speakers to leave the stage and you will see them back later when they will do their talks. So what will we be doing during this session? We will have three presentations, a more overarching presentation by Nico Larco on the key ingredients of MaaS and MaaS governance. And then both Stijn and Martin will talk about how they are dealing with new mobility and MaaS and the policies and the governance related to that in respectively the City of Antwerp and the City of Rotterdam. And we will see how to do polls and questions after each presentation. So for those who joined later, to the right in the Hopin platform, you have the Q&A, and we would like you to use that to post your questions to the speakers. And then I will take those in after each presentation. And finally, we hope to have some discussion on some of the topics that are cross-cutting in all the presentations. And we hope to wrap up at 5:30. So first of all, some scoping of the session, the definition of MaaS. We use the MaaS Alliance definition where we say MaaS is the integration of various forms of transport services into a single mobility service accessible on demand. And well, we're going to learn, first of all, how that is taken up in different countries, but also in different cities. So we have a broad scope of different focal points and levels today. From TNO, we did a comparative international case study analysis where we used the so-called governance framework to look at different cases. And the elements of this governance framework, I think today will also be relevant and will be put to the table by the different presenters. And if you look at the governance framework, it's about strategy and approach, the goals and the motivations, institutions, stakeholders, interests, but also the market structure and the policy and steering. And I think what's very specific also based on the research that we did is that you see that the contextual factors are also very relevant. What's your starting point? So we will be very curious to hear how the different cities are really working on that. So what do we hope to learn in this session? What do we hope that you have as a takeaway from this session? That you learned something about the different governance models for new mobility and MaaS, that we would like to talk about roles and responsibilities of both public and private partners, that we also want to discuss how to work across different silos, something that was also touched upon in the plenary session of Marije ten Kate, who talked about the Next City approach, and also what are quick wins and how can we get started right away? So we also want to end with some really practical ideas. So enjoy the session. And again, please put your questions in the Q&A. And then I would like to ask Nico to enter the scene and to kick off the first presentation on the key MaaS ingredients and the MaaS governance models.
Great, thank you, Geiske. Let me share my screen. Great. Can you all see that?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Geiske. As she mentioned, I am Nico Larco. I'm the director of the Urbanism Next Center here at the University of Oregon in the United States. It is now almost 7 o'clock in the morning, I think, and I've been up since 4. So we'll hope this goes well. And thank you once again in Europe for sending the sun our way. I always love that we get to see the beginning of the sun while you're seeing the end of it. What I'm going to talk about today is some work that we've done both at Urbanism Next and at TNO. As Geiske mentioned, I'm in both locations. I'm also a strategic advisor at TNO. And on the ingredients that are necessary for MaaS, and then thinking about that, the MaaS governance framework. And this is based on, as I mentioned, work that we've done here at Urbanism Next, but a lot of work that we've also done at TNO and a project that we did with INV at the Ministry of Transport and Water Management in the Netherlands. So if we look at the MaaS ingredients, we really look at this because if you think about the question of MaaS governance, it is not clear cut and there's no one clear way of doing it, right? As we started this work, we were trying to think of like what are the approaches that make the most sense. And part of the reason that there is no clean cut piece of this is that there's so many different parts of making MaaS work and there's so many different needs, roles, and configurations of governance. So if you think about the MaaS ingredients, we think of them as these 3 pieces. What do you need for MaaS to exist? What do you need for people, in other words, that there's services even out there? What do you need for uptake so that people start to use them? And what do you need for government steering? So once those things are up and running and people are using them, hopefully not afterwards, but as that's all happening, you can actually start shaping the way that happens. If we think about for MaaS to exist, we need things such as a number of transportation service providers, everything from all those different new mobility modes that we've talked about, and public transport, the MaaS platform, the booking payment protocols, data standards, and digital infrastructure. This is just to get the system in place. If you think about uptake, you need viable use cases that are going to make sense for people to use. You need communication so that people understand that these things exist. It has to be more convenient. There has to be pricing that actually makes sense for people. And then there's a whole set of behavioral nudges that might be needed to actually get people to start using these new systems, right? Like any new system. And then for government steering, you need data sharing requirements and data sharing culture, we'll say, steering mechanisms, all the tools and levers that the government can use to help kind of nudge, we'll say, how it is that the MaaS is deployed and how people are using it. And you need trust. This is what we found that's really important between public and private stakeholders. My sense you're going to be hearing a whole lot more about that from Stijn and from Martin. So the big question is, what is the role of governance in this? These are really different issues here, really different needs. And so how best might government be situated in this? Well, those are the questions that we were trying to answer as we did a case study. This was with Diana van Noordergraaf, Geiske, myself, Carla Munsel, and Marjolein Hazen, with TNO and INV, where we started to look at these different case studies from around the world to try to understand how MaaS was being governed. As Geiske mentioned, we developed this governance framework, which really puts in together, we'll say, all the pieces that come together to help decide how governance is happening. There's pieces specific to we'll say the actions people can take, right? The institution stakeholders, goals and motivations, market structure, policy and stream, but then there's all these contextual factors of how is the existing context organized, the government structure around MaaS, the culture that exists in terms of public-private partnership, those types of things. I'm only going to talk briefly about this, but we looked at 6 case studies in Austria, which has mostly the public sector and the public transport are organizing the MaaS market. This has changed slightly with the new government that came in a little over a year ago. But the public transport companies are the ones that are actually providing the MaaS platforms. In Ile-de-France in Paris, the Transport Authority is really highly involved in all this. They own the MaaS platform, they produce it themselves, and there's a lot of collaboration between public and private sectors parties. In Finland, which is where we think of as a little bit of the birthplace of MaaS, it's really mostly offered by the private sector players, and the public sector is only creating kind of a framework for those things to operate, but the driving is really happening from the private sector players. Continuing on, in Los Angeles, really interesting, completely different approach where it's really a series of private sector individual players in terms of the different transportation companies and the MaaS providers exist, and the government role is really trying to create data and sharing standards. MDS, obviously, the mobility data specifications came out of there, and they're working right now on developing incentive structures for MaaS steering. In Singapore, there's no specific regulation on MaaS, and it really is working within kind of like, we'll say, transportation mode silos. There's a large overarching mobility plan that's trying to steer those things, and they're really trying to push public transport as the backbone of a car-light city. And then in the Netherlands, enormous, large investment from the national level on 7 MaaS pilots from the different regions. Some of those are in place right now. COVID has disrupted a little bit, but large role from the public sector in organizing and steering all of this with cooperation from the private sector. Now, as we think about those initial MaaS ingredients and we think about these very different approaches in these case studies, one of the things that helps describe why there's such differences is that not everywhere has the same ingredients, the basic ingredients of what mobility options exist up and running. So we looked at these 6 different case studies, and you can see some of the modes that we would consider part of the whole MaaS marketplace aren't even allowed in some of these places. And in other places, they exist. I mean, a very good example is the Netherlands, where there's many modes that exist, but really public transport and bike share are the largest potential MaaS players. E-mopeds are starting to emerge. Car sharing and TNCs, the transportation network companies like Uber, are really very, very minimal. So they're very different contexts of what's available. You also start to see really different approaches in terms of who are the primary actors. As we mentioned before, and you can see here, in some of these places, the private actors are really the ones who are in the lead. They're the ones that are pushing the development of these strategies and really kind of the driving force. But the public sector is really trying to set regulation to help steer these things. In other places, the public-private cooperation is really what's the main driver, with public actor coordinating these things. There you see that in Ile-de-France in the Netherlands. And then in Austria, completely different. It's a public transport provider that's really leading with a public actor steering. Actors that provide the MaaS app, right? So if we talked about what kind of transportation services exist, the MaaS app is another key component there, right? And again, this is tremendously varied. In some places, the private sector are the ones who are completely running and developing the MaaS service themselves, running the apps. In other places, this is a consortium between public and private sector. In the Netherlands, like that, could be the Transport Authority or the public transit company itself. So very different approaches here. This is interesting as well, and this ties a little bit to what exists or what people see as the next important step. Some cities and regions will say are primarily trying to their primary actions along individual modes, where other are really trying to figure out how to integrate these modes across these different these pieces. So really thinking about how the MaaS app comes together. And in the market strategy, and this has a lot to do with what exists, some are really trying to get the actual deployment of mobility options, while other are, Los Angeles and Singapore have a lot of mobility options that exist already. And so they're trying to figure out, how do we shape the deployment of these existing mobility options? It's a little bit of like a supply and demand issue with these. In terms of societal goals, what's interesting is that these were slightly mentioned in all of them, but they really take the lead. So some of these in different regions, right? Sustainability and accessibility, absolutely some of the motivations when you talk to the public sector of why they're doing these things. But then as you start to get to issues of efficiency, social inclusion, and another really interesting one, which is leveling the playing field, often talking about the role of either taxis, mostly taxis, or public transport, trying to figure out a way of making sure that everyone has access to these things and it's not being dominated, for instance, by transportation network companies. And then putting all of that together, you see a huge range in terms of the policy instruments that are being used in each one of these cases. Many of these regions outside of Los Angeles is actually putting money into developing the MaaS ecosystem. We'll say it might not be the MaaS platform itself, but the MaaS ecosystem actually funding these things. Most all of them are facilitating cooperation, and they see this as an important thing. You're going to hear some really important and interesting examples from Martin and Stijn on some of those efforts. What's really interesting is some of the places are developing standards themselves. Los Angeles, I think, being one of the leads in that, obviously. The Netherlands working strong on that. Some of them are regulating market access, data sharing agreements. You can see that there's a whole range. Some cities are really trying to develop pilots themselves. Most of the places are trying to develop pilots themselves, and then hoping that those things take off larger. Many of the places are doing research on these topics. Obviously, we're a part of that. And some of them are regulating on public space. So I just presented a lot of the different pieces that we're seeing everywhere. What is it that we take away from all of this? And what is it that we really found as we looked at all these different case studies? Well, a couple of key things. One, MaaS is in the earliest stages of development, even though there's a tremendous amount of promotion, we'll say, about how MaaS is taken off. When you start looking at the ground and you start looking at how much uptake there is, how many companies are involved, how many transportation modes exist, we are really in the very earliest stages of development. And in most places, the focus is on that very first category of those MaaS ingredients that we talked about, which is how do we even get MaaS to exist? How do we get the basic elements in place so that it even exists? Not even mentioning yet a lot of the issues of how do we get uptake to happen or steering. There's very little steering that's happening to date. And the contexts are tremendously different in terms of how many companies exist, how many modes exist. Are they talking to each other? Are there data standards that exist? What's the we'll say regulatory culture and context in terms of and the relationship between the public and private sector? And because of this, what you're seeing are very different roles, very different potential roles for governance in this. And what we found is that very much the role of governance needs to fit those needs. So it's almost that taking that first ingredients of MaaS, figuring out what is it that if you're trying to have MaaS happen in your region or trying to figure out how best to work with it, what is it that you're missing? Almost doing an assessment of that, and then figuring out what is it that is missing and where might government help fill in those gaps. One of the issues, though, that we're seeing is that even though a lot of the work and a lot of the focus on governance has really been in these case studies on helping create MaaS, there has to be an eye on the longer term steering. And some of these regions are doing this and some not as much. But thinking about how it is that you can end up having, for instance, data standards and a data sharing kind of culture and requirements are going to be key for those latter stages. So thinking about those things in the future. I think one thing you'll hear a lot about is trust being an absolute key for this between the public and private sector, but also between private sector actors as well as the stakeholders in the community. And I think the last piece that I would say that came out of this work is that there's no clear winning governance model. There's no role of government that really we'd say that absolutely is a leader in pushing MaaS to go forward. And I put yet there in question marks because I'm not sure if there really is one winning governance model. It seems that because of the vast differences in context and the vast differences of where these different regions are, it really might be different there might be different needs in different places. I think this is a space to absolutely continue to be looking at and thinking about to better understand what other people are doing, maybe not to find the ideal, but to figure out how those relate to challenges you might have in your region and context, and how best to shape the governance of this area. And with that, I'll say thank you and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Nico, for this nice introduction, which I know well, of course, as being part of that team. It's a bit quiet in the Q&A, so I'll start kicking off with a question. So, Nico, what was most surprising for you from the research, and at the same time, maybe you could we prepared a poll, and I think we have some 20 people in the session, so it would really be nice to. Well, if there are no Q&As, to really grasp a bit how the people in the session are thinking about this. So I would like the people to ask the people to go to the poll, and Nico's poll should be visible now, which is the question, who should lead MaaS development? So I'm really curious to know how people are thinking about that. And while everybody is thinking what to answer, I'd like to ask you the answer, Nico. What was for you most surprising from the research of the comparative analysis that we did?
I guess the most surprising thing was, on the one hand, how the early state of MaaS in many of these places. I mean, we were looking for places that we thought were the most advanced in MaaS development, and we thought what we were going to be doing is looking at a whole lot of on the ground applications and figuring out what was really working best. And what we found is that this is very much in development. The other part, I think, is that there's so much of a focus on just getting MaaS to exist, so much of a focus on that, and not as much on figuring out how best to steer it. So it's almost that a lot of the governance efforts have really been around enabling setting it up. I'll say, one of the really interesting things for me was some of the work that LA has done, which is interesting because it's the one that I think has we'll say, a fairly light touch on the regulatory side compared to some of the other places, and yet they're really setting this up in a incremental and like long game plan of what is the basic information that we need as we start out. And how can we slowly start bringing different modes into this MaaS ecosystem so that we can regulate it in a way that we can get to positive outcomes.
Yeah, interesting. So I'm looking at the answers of the vote already, which is a bigger range of answers and also some others. So what's your idea on this question?
I think, if I had to say who should really lead on MaaS development, I think it has to be a combination of the municipal governments and then the potentially public transport companies. With this, so municipal governments, I think, are the ones who are
the ones that nobody voted for. You mean?
Ones for nobody voted for? Yes. I think municipal governments have a lot to say in how this is all organized. In terms of, I should say, making sure that the organization leads to societal outcomes, positive societal outcomes. And then that public transport companies, the reason I mention them is that I feel like for MaaS to be successful, for us to really get the positive outcomes that we want, they have to be the backbone of this. Now, the actual providers of the platforms, the actual transportation service providers, obviously those people need to do those things. I do not think municipal governments should be building apps, and I'm not exactly sure how much public transportation companies should be building apps. We've seen mixed results, but I feel like the municipal governments really have to be one of the leaders in this.
Great. I think it's a nice, what we would say, bridge to our next speaker. So Stijn, if you can enter the stage. So before you start, what do you think about the answer of Nico to his own poll?
Well, I chose other, although I'm from a municipal government, which I think it's all of the above. It's not, it's a joint effort if you want to make it work. Of course, municipal governments have best feeling on the ground for it, but they should not develop it. Neither should public transport authorities or on a national level. It's such a combination that it's a joint effort. And I think that's what we're doing in Antwerp, of course, because we do have a winning governance model, Nico. I have to say that because I'm from Antwerp.
Thanks. So tell us more. The stage is yours.
Yeah. Let's see if everything is share screen. Okay, so normally you should see my screen. Quick introduction for those of you who don't know Antwerp. We are somewhere at that red arrow. That was Brussels for a second, but we are up north, close to the Netherlands, Germany, and France. And we are part of a dense network. We have a couple of ring highways around Antwerp. Everything from the Netherlands has to go past Antwerp to go to France. Germany, France is a big connection. So we have massive challenges on mobility there. We try to solve that with a lot of infrastructural work, what we call the hard measures. So we've gonna extend the road infrastructure, build extra bicycle infrastructure, or a lot of this has already been done. Extend the public transport network, all of that. But of course, you can build it. That doesn't necessarily mean that they will come unless it's a wider road, and it will be congested within a couple of years. So that's why we started also with Smart Ways to Antwerp, which is our soft measures approach, where we focus on the modal time and flex shift. What is different with Smart Ways to Antwerp is we're not part of the mobility department within the city development unit. We are part of the communication and participation unit. By now, we're all experts on mobility too, but it gives a bit the different approach that we use towards mobility. Of course, we still have our traffic engineers and modeling people doing it, but we're working together to find that balance between user behavior and engineering approach. To show that it does work, these are some of the numbers. Of course, 2020 is a bit an odd year, as we've all experienced, but you can see that we've had a decline of car use and an increase in bicycle use, if I'm correct. So we did manage some shift. How do we do it? We do a lot of marketing and communication, as said. So we've built that Smart Ways to Antwerp brand. I'm not going into detail of all those things, but just want to show that it's. We often get a question like, we've built a route planner, and they go like, so how has that route planner accomplished any modal shift? Or you have 3 MaaS players active in Antwerp, how has that contributed to that modal shift? It's difficult to say because there's so many things that we're doing, and I think that's the key thing in that whole MaaS modal shift shared mobility thing. It's not one thing that you can do or have to do or should do. It's all of them that you have to include in your approach. I think for the MaaS approach, governments, the marketplace for mobility is what comes closest there. It's so we have about 150 external partners who have a mobility solution somehow, and we support them in many ways. I think 2 of the key approaches there is a simple partnership. So we are communication. We do a lot of communication. We have a visible brand, so companies can use that in their own communication. They can use our branding. We communicate about them, press moments, and all of that. We use them also in our employers approach. We involve them if we have challenges or if we want to see how we can solve different problems. So we try to involve them on the one hand to make sure that the things that we implement do have their impact on the whole ecosystem and on our end goals. But it also builds trust among all the different players to exchange knowledge, exchange ideas, and things like that. And then we have the project partnerships where we focus on different projects. We have a project call now running, or a project running on MaaS, where we stimulate the integration between a mobility player and a MaaS player. It's limited in budget, and it's always focused on giving an incentive to the end user. So, for example, we don't give a bag of money to the 2 players and say you have to integrate with. They have to develop an open API for the integration, and it's all transaction based. So if they do the integration and they don't sell any tickets through that integration, they don't get any money. Simple as that. So that has resulted in a couple of very interesting approaches where we have off-street parking integrated in MaaS apps, carpooling, car sharing, even mobility vouchers that small shops can buy and give to their customers to come to the shop in different ways. So it's very interesting approach to try out new and innovative solutions, but always with the idea that at the end of the project call, the project has to continue and has to be able to stand on its own. The other part is the whole technical development, and there we're balancing a bit between developing our own MaaS app, which we're not going to do, but we do have all the services available to support that multimodal, intermodal trip planner. We have our wonderful intermodal trip planner that works for the whole Benelux, and I think that's also one of the approaches. What I often see is when a city or a municipality launches a solution, whether it's a route planner or a MaaS app, it's focused on their own region or even city boundaries, like Berlin, and not outside. If I look at the numbers, people in Antwerp move around already in a way that we want. It's from people coming from outside of Antwerp in, where we have to change the behavior. So that's why we don't believe that we should build a MaaS app. The MaaS app should be focused outside to the audience outside of Antwerp and not inside. And we're building also the whole backbone, because we've learned that for a lot of the both mobility providers and MaaS providers, they experience a technical barrier, the integration of the data, the conversion of different data standards, making it possible to integrate. Since we as a city already had our smart city platform, in which we have set up data pipelines and data conversion, whether it's real time or historic data, we've set that up too, and we open up those data pipelines to others, so it makes it easier for them to integrate the services. So we try to be a facilitator of sort, take away all the barriers for all the players to work together. Now, one of the reasons why we're focused on users, this is just to show you. Left 2010 were the modes that were available back then. 2020, that's what all the different modes that are often used and which are promoted and are available. And that's not mentioning all the different providers. Like with shared scooters, we have 3 providers for the moment in Antwerp, bike sharing, car sharing. So that's one of the reasons why we've also focused on that route planner to give neutral advice on all these modes. And on the other hand, that we also try to support all the different MaaS players, in Antwerp, in the integration of those solutions, because we want to make sure that the user has a seamless experience from door to door. One way to do that is the whole digital aspect, and that's where we're focusing on. Just a couple of things to show off. We did a great job there, let's be honest. So we have our mobility map with all the information, so the user can see a walking distance. I have these mobility solutions around me. We've created the route planner, which is, again, intermodal. So take the car to the train station, take the train. I'm not sure if it's in here, but it also have the shared mobility scooter solution added to it. Because sometimes it's again, that's the communication. It's just about letting the user know that there's a bus stop around the corner, walking in the opposite direction of which he normally walks, that it might be faster than taking his car. Not sure if I have a solution here, but this is also a whole list of route advice from my home to work. And for example, the fastest route here is take the car to not the train station that I would normally take, but one further, which has better parking opportunities too. So that's a win-win there. And then take the train and take the foldable bicycle, in this case, to the end location. This is not something that I would normally do if I just have to figure it out myself. And if I use Google Maps, I will get car advice or public transport advice. So it already takes a barrier away for the the user. We've also included taxi advice because they also play an important role, I think, in all mobility solutions. But of course, let's not forget what the easiest and simplest and best solution is, whether you look at all the sustainability goals or health goals or whatever you want. It's biking and walking. So we've included that to put more focus on that. Try to use some parameters for nudging people to use it. The walking example here, the 2 hours and 49 minutes. Not too many people will do that. True, but for shortened distances, that works too, of course. Getting the route advice is one thing, finding your actual way is another, so we're also building a navigator on top of this. Now, again, the focus is here on the MaaS governance model, I know, but we try to put this next to the MaaS solution so that people have at least get a neutral ID. And as Nico already said, it's the integration of the mobility solutions in the MaaS apps. It's still not completely there yet because they also have to take into account the booking and things like that. So this way we can already provide the right information to the people. We can nudge them. We provide them the right information, the right time. We also, through the marketplace, we give them we can give them trial offers. We have our employees approach where we reach out to the various users so that they already start thinking differently about mobility. I'm not thinking anymore in terms of I have to take my car, or I just walk outside, check the route planner, and I'll make it. And if I stay a bit longer, I miss my train for that, no problem. I just hop. I can find the closest shared mobility solution, and I can still get home. And it's that way of thinking that we try to promote through everything that we are doing. Now, the whole program of smart ways to Antwerp is quite expensive. So some of the quick wins I think that we've learned is we've set up multiple campaigns in Belgium, Netherlands, the whole of Benelux. But just a radio publicity still works best to reach the audience that you want to reach, and that's a car user. I think that's also often the discussion within the whole MaaS and governance models. Everybody is afraid that public transport users will switch to shared mobility solutions, will switch to, or walking will switch to. That's not important. In the end, we all want to reach that car user, and you reach them through radio publicity because they're stuck in traffic anyway, and still a lot of people listen to the radio on that, and you reach them by integrating car solutions in a MaaS app. I think that's also key. With the off-street parking, we can reach more car users, change their behavior much more than have an app where everything is integrated in that one app, except for off-street parking, because the car owner will not use that app in that case. Other thing that a key thing is learn by doing. And then I see that I'm already going over time, but I cannot see any reactions from Geiske. So another nice thing that we did, which is that cheap to do, is with our employers approach, we put together a couple of the CEOs of the big companies in Antwerp, and we send them out on a treasure hunt in pairs of two. Let them try out all the mobility solutions so they could experience all the different modes, and then give them a package together with their HR managers on how to implement like a mobility budget and then after that, after we convinced them, we gave them a trial offer for the employees so they could try out electric bikes and things like that. And through making the CEOs involved there, having a couple of B2B MaaS apps that can provide easy access to all mobility solutions, and then letting the employees try it out, we've managed to get a shift from 60% car use to 40% car use for those companies that we targeted. So, and then another thing, it's always about expensive big integrations when you look at the technical side, and data standardizations and uniformity and all of that. Trust is the cheapest way to integrate services. I know some of the services are integrated based on a CSV file that is exchanged every once in a while. And at the end of the month, they tell them like, okay, 20 people used a code. Okay, we pay you 20 euros. So that is often forgotten, that sometimes it can be that easy if you trust each other. And then one more thing, we also sometimes get the question, Smart Waste to Antwerp, MaaS app, as mentioned before, we are not a MaaS app. We support as many MaaS apps as possible, because I think there's not one app to rule them all. It's about a specific approach, like we have the KBC banking app, which has an integration of MaaS services. So you don't have to have a separate MaaS app, but you also have a B2B mobility budget MaaS apps, things like that. So you have to support all of them. For me, MaaS is not about that one app. MaaS is about the whole ecosystem, is about integrating the different services, or being able to integrate two services, even just two services with each other. That's already a solution for 90% of the people. Again, we're doing a lot of things, and it might have been a bit chaotic, my explanation. We have a great team working on all of that. Very lucky that we can do all of that. And well, if you have more questions and more specific questions, you can always reach me. I think MaaS and Stijn, and then you'll find me anyway, I hope. So that was quickly, but still too long, my presentation. So I'll stop sharing and see.
Well, we had some extra time, Stijn, so don't worry about that. Thanks for your presentation. I'm going to go to the Q&A question right away. So Peter van Buiten, he asked a question about, will MaaS solve the transport poverty? So is it accessible for all people? Will it really be cheaper for the people using it versus the ones that offering the services? How are you dealing with that?
My personal take on it, MaaS will not solve anything. It's the wheels on the ground that will make transport accessible. It's the wheels on the ground that will make sure that you don't have transport poverty. If you don't have, should have included that slide, but you have 5 layers in mobility. MaaS is a top level that binds it all together. But if you don't have decent cycling and walking infrastructure, shared mobility will not take off. MaaS will only be something that is used for route planning. So I often see a lot of discussion. We have to regulate MaaS, and MaaS has to deliver data and all of that. Yes, but let's first start with the basics. It's, I think, in Antwerp, well, some would disagree on it, but I think Antwerp, Netherlands, the many cities that you investigated to, they have the basics in order. But if your bus is not inclusive, if you cannot get on your bus for any reason whatsoever, MaaS will not solve that. It's not if you look, yeah. So it's a lot of people think that MaaS will make things cheaper and more accessible, and it's not. But it will, it creates opportunities.
So I'll ask the people to have a look at the poll that you just shared about how can we change people's travel behavior. So please have a look at that. And then to build a bit on the question I asked and the answer you gave. So, okay, yes, it's I think it relates to the key MaaS ingredients that that Nico was also talking about. You need to have the wheels on the ground, otherwise you can't start anyway. But I think this question is also about, okay, once you have the wheels on the ground, where are those wheels on the ground? Are they everywhere or only in specific locations? And how do you make the offerings? So the offerings that the providers deliver, are they like affordable for all?
Yeah, so what we do now, so for the shared mobility solutions, we have an operating license in Antwerp, in which we limit the number of vehicles and providers, but we also require them to have spread the vehicles over certain areas so that it's not only in the commercial interesting region that all the vehicles are located. So it's a requirement to operate in Antwerp. We've been playing with some of the ideas to make it balance out, so that if, for example, if you roll out vehicles in a certain area, which might not be commercially that interesting, that you're allowed to have more vehicles in the commercially interesting area.
So it's an exchange.
Yeah,
to
like
get the right balance.
out, you have your goals, we have our goals. We're not gonna pay you to deliver cheaper tickets in that area or something like that. I think it's a policy, a political choice to make, of course, but
yeah. So if you look at the first results of the polls, people believe in communication. So what are you doing on communication? Is this your preferred answer?
Well, I'm that one of the two concrete blocks, but it's about communication, obviously. It's the perception, or we have to take into account that we're fighting, not fighting, but marketing and communication wise, it's the car industry which is billions of euros into communication in creating that feeling, and I think we have to do that too. If that's all the different layers of mobility, and we have to shape that whole user experience. Actually, we shouldn't talk about MaaS. We should talk about Max, mobility as an experience, because it's even for me personally. I have all the apps on my phone. I have flexible working hours. I have budget to spend on it. I can't claim it back, sadly enough, but so it's on my own cost that I do the testing. But so I have everything to go for to use MaaS. But if I walk outside after a bad night of sleep and the car is there and the pedestrian area is crap, I get into the car. If I get at the train station and the bikes are a mess there, I get into a car. So it's that. Even though I know that I will be stuck in traffic and I have to look for a parking spot, but that's the perception, and that's the how deeply ingrained the car is, and that is something that we have to work on together with the whole MaaS ecosystem, and make car part of the MaaS ecosystem. I mean, sometimes it's a solution too.
Yeah, interesting. Thanks. I think it's a nice next step to our next presentation. Yeah. So Martin, please join us here. Stijn, thank you for now. We'll see you later. Like how you're really trying to, involve people and, seduce them is not the right word, but really challenge them to change. And I think you will also tell something about that, Martin. So please, the stage is yours.
Yes, thank you. Now I'm trying to share. I will go to the beginning. You can see it?
Yes, great. Yes, working perfect.
All right, thank you. Very interesting also to hear the story, Stijn, from Antwerp. I think in Rotterdam, we have a new and green mobility approach. So it's not only about mobility as a service, I will tell you today. And I think I agree with on the poll with Nico asked. It should be a joint venture of several players in this field, and the municipality is very important, but as well as the public transportation companies. But I think there is also very important. There is a kind of how do you say regie to take control. So the national government should provide this. So I think there's a lot of several players in this field. That I showed you is very interesting because this is our council board, our council of the city of Rotterdam. 5 years ago, it was not possible to get them on the bike and cycle to Rotterdam, but nowadays it's a normal way. So I think that is what important is in if you're looking at also the picture Mariah showed at the end in her keynote. It's an important condition to change the mindset in the city, but from economic city, and that means that you need to change the mindset from car-minded to walking and cycling, public transportation, and clean mobility. that is, I think, an important mindset to develop also mobility as a service. And Rotterdam has this history of a car-loving city. We're proud of it, so we're not hating. But we are changing the mindset now, and I think that's a very important thing to do. And it started more than 10 years ago, because Stijn said also something very important. You have to get the infrastructure that is important to change that mindset. So you have to invest in cycling and walking, and that's what we call that more than 10 years ago in the city of Rotterdam, especially in the heart. And we changed all the car parking, for example, in more attractive public space, more green. We lanes several to more lanes for cycling, and that's start today and get finished tomorrow. You need to have a long-term vision about that, and then you can change the mindset. And that's also important is you need icons. If you need a new icons for mobility, which opened in 2014, is this new icon, and you can see it now. It used to be a whole blurry area. Is not very nice to be there, with all buses, taxis, everything. You couldn't find. But nowadays it's a green area where people walk and where people cycle. And it's also important, underneath the square there is a big storage for cyclists, for more than 5,000. And there was a big discussion with the national the NS company, who said they want to charge people, and we be for free, because we want people to stimulate the bike. And that's what we do, and we did and still doing. But now it's it's a little bit how you say, the cyclists are now almost getting out of the ground. So, well, we have to think also about another thing, but it's very important if you want to stimulate ways of mobility, then you really should think about to charge about that. Oh, I'm going back the wrong way, I'm sorry. And also, like I said, you need good example, you need good info. Single just opened this summer, and it's very a pity that well, you couldn't see it live. Maybe in next year when with Urbanism next. But it's a good example. Less car lanes, more room for cyclists and pedestrians. But it's also very costly, and that is something on every spot in your city. But you have to do it on the main spots, which change the mindset. And Central Station is important, and this is our main boulevard. Council is seated, so that's very important. And it changed the whole mobility also a lot. A lot of cars in the city, but the red line you can see it's declining. So the car will decline in the heart of the city, and the green and blue line, they will grow. And the blue line is the public transportation with pedestrians, of course, and also the green line is the booming of the cycling in the heart of the city, and that will also continue. So, and that is why we convinced our aldermen that we need a healthy mobility policy, and that's a very important thing to do. We call that the Rotterdam mobility approach. It was on 21 Congress in October of which was a very big and successful Congress that helps walking as a very important mode in mobility, and that is important to also again to change that mindset. And we're using, I will not discuss them all, but the important is you need to create more space for pedestrians, but also everybody should be included, and that's very important. And like I said in the beginning, it's not about hating the car, but because the car will be clean, the car will be part of sharing systems, but it's about in the heart of the city, and that should be less. But if you have a good, clean sharing car mobility, it could create a lot of space for cyclists and pedestrians because you need less parking places, you need less lanes, and that's so it's important to embrace that. And also about the logistics that will be will turning into clean logistics. Instead of the big trucks that coming into the city, it will be more smaller, like cargo bikes and things like that. So this whole mobility system in the city is changing. In Rotterdam, we see that as well. These are a lot of providers, for example, water taxi, and that is very good. So because if the market provides you with a lot of facilities, then as a city, you can stimulate it, like the clean scooters, the e-scooters, but there's also a lot of restrictions you can do, because one of the providers, Mobike, they just put their bikes everywhere, so it was a complete mess in public space. So we need regulation and rules about that. So now one of the providers is out, but there will be new ones, and so that's also important to stimulate the new ones. But they must set to our goals of the city, and public space that is green and healthy is important as a goal. Like I said, it's also about water taxi, because Rotterdam has this river. There's a lot of connections we can make, and also in for the city of Rotterdam, but also in the region, in the Netherlands, as especially the public transportation is the back as a service, and also in the city we can create new public which can be electric buses, which can be like in Gothenburg. There's already an example, but it's also important because in the heart of the areas you can develop smaller ways of mobility, the clean mobility, like the bikes, but also the scooters, and they can connect to those nodes. So that also means less car mobility in the heart of every area. And well, I'm almost there now. So this is one of the last slides. As we can see, for example, I'm not the mobility as a service expert. I'll be honest with you. I'm not like Stijn, but what we see is that there is now a development going on. Like Nico said in his beginning of his presentation, it's at the start. It's at the start. And that we see on the level of the metropolitan region of Rotterdam, The Hague, but also on the Randstad. And well, we're trying to create that. And it's with the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water. That's very important, because also we need somebody in charge. And well, at the beginning, you can see that you have to do a good inventory about what is your strong position in MaaS and what we have to develop. And one of the main issues in this, as you see it on the scale, we have a very good public transportation system. Can be a little bit better, so it's not a 5, but it's a 4. So that's a very good start for a good system. At the end, it's good to see that well, we have a very good basic infrastructure, also about the bike lanes, the walking in the heart of the city. But we have this public transportation with the metro, the tram, the rail, and there is one note I want to make sure that mobility as a service is not only about car mobility or clean car share mobility, because it's also about walking, it's about biking, and all the other things of mobility, because it's very attractive in the heart of the city, and not only about car. And it's very important to know about who can afford it. So maybe sometimes you have to look at several people who cannot pay very much amount of money for to have an how do you say, well, to do on the to have a like for sharing a car or something, because it costs them too much, and that is something we should if you look at the system of MaaS, because at the end It's also about, like I said, it's about the goals for the city. We need this new green and mobility approach, and that's what we do in Rotterdam. So, thank you, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Martin, thanks. Again, we have a poll, so people please have a look, and then we'll start with some questions to you, Martin. Your latest statement, it was about the inclusiveness, and I also just posed that question to Stijn. So, what are you as Rotterdam doing now to make sure that, well, your Rotterdam mobility approach, your strategy, that it's inclusive?
What we're doing, yeah, like I said, one of the examples is that we stimulate the bike facilities. We're looking at that. That's, for example, for the public ones are for free. That's one of the things. See, there is at this moment, and that's very, you can say. But if you're 65 or older, then you have for the city of Rotterdam, you have a free ticket to ride public transportation. But the public transportation company says to the city of Rotterdam, you have to pay for that. So that's, for example, that means that the city every year has to pay 6 million, I believe, to give it to the public transportation to get to have a free ride with well, that's in our own city. So that's, I think there's a little of, you could say it's a little bit sick in the system at this moment. So that's why my first statement was in the beginning that we need to sit together with the public transportation companies, with the national government, with the region, with the municipalities, what Nico said, and to what are the goals we want to achieve. So, and that means inclusiveness I think is a very important goal, because if you don't have access to the mobility system, you cannot join the society. So is that what we try to achieve? So so that's I think that's a very important. And at this moment in Rotterdam, we're not so far at that point. We're not, I think, but like I said, I'm not the expert at that. It's not. I don't hear these kinds of things.
If you look at the examples that you gave about the vision and the ambitions that you have, one of the questions in the Q&A is the question if mobility as a service or logistics as a service, if that could be combined, could transport of goods and people be combined, and is that something that you see as the future?
Yeah, definitely. We're looking at this moment now. That's also in the beginning at. We're looking at the mobility hubs, you can say, at the edge of the highways, where the big freight trucks can change to smaller amount, like the cargo bike. We have already a lot of cargo bikes in the city, and well, that's why we also need to provide a lot of cycling lanes, and for cargo and for the people. So I think in future that can be very well combined, and well. Maybe, and that's also interesting to think, maybe to stop way too ahead, but electric lanes only for clean lanes for cars and clean logistics is something we could provide. So I think really go together. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. And then one final question. Somebody's asking, well, in the Netherlands, in the municipalities, the local elections are coming up. Do you see any change on how that affects the work that you've been doing and how that good work will stay or change? What's your feeling about that?
That's a good question. That's well, this is a personal answer, right? So this is only my gut feeling, but I think it will be difficult. In the city of Rotterdam now, we had a very good program. And the COVID is a key player, and what we see now is that public transportation is not so going very well at this moment. We see also just the service will be getting down in the city. The growth of the second car, you can say, second-hand car, And if let's say the right wing of the politics in Rotterdam, which is a very strong bloc, they get the upper hand in let's say March or April, then it could switch, but they also see what kind of in front of their nose. That's very good. They have to call single, so they know you cannot do that at every time. And
it will be next to their office.
Yeah. No, but you have to set the right goals, and I think the health of people in the city, and also if you want to visit the city, should be important. So the mobility should be clean, that kind of development, more space. Yeah. I think that and the attractiveness also means to visit the city, to have more economic development. So you have to set it. That's what I try, and not about mobility, but about city level.
Yeah, interesting. Well, looking at the poll, everybody agrees with the fact that MaaS is more than clean electric car sharing. So I think you've brought across the message that you wanted to share. I think we'll go to a broader discussion. There are also some questions coming in for that. So I'd like to invite Nico and Stijn also to the stage to have a bit of a broader discussion. And one of the topics that we wanted to talk about when we were preparing this session was on, well, a further discussion on these governance models for new mobility and MaaS. And one of the questions that came in that I'd like to pose to all of you is, do you expect that MaaS will be a real big change for the mobility system? And the question that was also posed is, do you think that it will push public transit out, that it would be taken over by transport service providers? And then what would be the role of the government? So Nico, you're nodding your head. So what are you thinking?
I'll just start. So will MaaS be a huge transformation of the transportation system? I would say hopefully, if, as Stijn said earlier, we end up being able to lure people out of their cars, right? I mean, that would be the biggest piece. But the second part of the question of like, will it be kicking out transportation, transit companies? If MaaS, as I said before, MaaS has to be built on the backbone of public transport. And it's kind of interesting as we were doing the case studies, guys, that you and I worked on, as we talked to different people around the world on these things, you know, sometimes people would say like, oh, you know, they've developed MaaS, but really, you know, most people are just taking buses and things. They're not really using all these different modes. And my answer to that was like, great, right? So if most of the work is happening on mass transport, and then we're using these other modes to help supplement that, so people make the decision that maybe I don't need the car, or I'm not going to take the car this time. That is the ideal scenario. I really see MaaS as the main thing that it would really help with, or that kind of ideal scenario is that it's helping expand the reach of MaaS of transit services and reducing the need for the car. That to me is the ideal.
So I think you agree, Stijn. Anything to add?
Yeah, I think I think the biggest opportunity for having a MaaS app is mainly making it easier to give incentives to nudge people towards other behavior. You can also start defining that the nudge you want to have mode independent. You want to have them out of the car. It doesn't really matter whether it's into public transport or shared mobility, but you mainly want to get them out of the car first. But also, I do agree with Nico. If it's simple, if you need a digital solution to know when your bus runs, if you have to think about your mobility, you lose the user. He will get into a car. I know I know the hours of the train here by heart. I just walk there and I see what shows up. And if I miss the train, I have to wait 15 minutes. But I'm mentally prepared for that. If I have to go to the bus station, which would bring me faster to work, and I have to check my app or book a ride for it, or have to go and look for a shared mobility solution, if I have to do that daily, you don't do that. You get back into the car. So it's MaaS can make it predictable and make it easier for the uncertain moments, but we have to take into account that people are creatures of habit, and that is something we have to cover first. And the MaaS, the integration, the combined products, the subscription models, that is for that other 20%, but we're not there yet. Let's first get 80% of the people using different ways.
Yeah. And Martin, how does MaaS fit in like your overall, so the mobility approach that you have in Rotterdam? How do you see that relationship?
Well, I agree with Nico that it should help to develop the green and the new mobility approach. So that's one point, and I think it should be very attractive, like Stijn said. So that's very important in the way how MaaS can develop. And I think the role of the public transportation are very important, especially in the Netherlands, especially in our region. So we need to have a good discussion about the service they provide and also about the costs. I think that, like I said, it could rule out people from being in the society. That are the main issues here to discuss. And I was one more thing the role of the government, like for us as a city, it should be very clear about our goals. So that means that we need space for walking, cycling, and other things, and less for the car. And then, if you have that clear goal, the MaaS can provide that kind of service. And I think it will be a generation thing. So also in the city, you see the switch from possession of mobility to sharing mobility.
But there, I think
different.
Related. Go ahead, Stijn.
And I think adding to that, what also shouldn't be forgotten is that MaaS and parking policy and spatial planning are all, or sustainable mobility, let's call it that way, because it's broader than MaaS. Spatial planning and parking policy are interconnected. As long as it's easy to find a parking spot, that's what I meant with the concrete blocks.
Yeah.
Best way to solve. If you see at all the roadworks happening in Antwerp, that has created 50-60% of the shift, then providing the users with at the right moment, the right solutions, the right alternatives to try out. That's how you get it. But if the roads would have been cleared and there would be no traffic jams, everybody gets in their car. If you see people park for free on the street, like they do in my neighborhood, they'll park in the street and on the pedestrian areas because they all have 2-3 cars. So
so it's also about the incentives that you have in place to stimulate like other modes or de-stimulate using the car.
Make sure that you have honest pricing, that you have you internalize the external costs. So cars still costs more to the dog in the background, but somebody else is going to solve it, I hope. But it's there's no fair price comparison with the cost of a car. I think cars still cost more to society than any other mode, but people don't feel it because it's not directly related to their expenses in using that car. And I think that has to change, and we have to find a way where we go mode independent in our taxation, in our approach to everything. A 2-ton car with
policy tools and levers, right? That you could put into place and what would work. And I think related to the discussion we had earlier, we were talking about public transit and acknowledging that it's really important and could be a backbone, and referring to the research that we did and for instance the case study in Singapore, there it is an important thing, a backbone that they really focus on. But I do want to refer to the context that you were in, because in some areas public transit isn't a good backbone because it's just not there. So then you need to look for other options that would fit in your situation. So I think it's like there's no one size fits all. It's a tailor-made approach, but you need to look at those things that are already working well, not to create new issues. Nico?
Yeah, two comments. First of all, one of the things that I love, in the way that Martin and Stijn are talking about this is, I feel like we've like hit a important maturation of the whole MaaS concept, right? Which, if you look back, 2 years ago, pre-COVID, it seemed like MaaS was going to be like this incredible shiny object that was going to solve everything for us everywhere. And I think we've there's a real realization that, one, there's a ton of opportunity in it, but it's built up on a lot of things that we've been working on already, right? So it's going to help with how we think about public transit. It's going to give us more options, right? It's going to create all these different opportunities for us because we can use these other modes. It's hopefully going to get people out of cars, but it's also built on what infrastructure we have, which is everything from the roads to the bike paths to all these things, but also our density of development, right? So it's not like MaaS is not a silver bullet. MaaS is one of the many tools that hopefully we're using to help make cities that are more sustainable, livable, equitable, all these pieces. So we still need to think about the mundane mobility. We still need to think about development patterns. We still need to think about density. We still need to think about parking requirements. All these things. This is all part of that system.
I think
sorry. Go ahead.
No, I think there, if you look at the mobility budget we have in Belgium, that shows clearly, I think, a good approach to it. So in Belgium, you can get a company car from the moment they throw it at you, sadly enough. But we also have the mobility budget in which, one, you can get a lease car, but you can also use that budget for a lease bike, for a subscription to public transport. But it also includes one component that I find incredible that they got that approved, and that's down payment of your house. You can pay your rent with that mobility budget if you work from home. And I think that shows that way of thinking. That's more outcome based. You want people to move in a different way or not use their car. And one of the options is not moving, and might be a lease bike, it might be public transport. You leave that up to the user, but you make sure that, okay, if it's up to me, I would take out the car leasing, but you leave it up to the user to fill it in according to their own needs. Because it's so personal, the mobility choices, the mobility challenges that you have, that it's no one size fits all. And their MaaS is a B2B MaaS solution is great for the companies because they only have one contact, one payment each month, and you give the employees complete freedom on how to use it and nudge them.
And one of the things that. So,
yeah, I wanted to bring one of the Q&A questions that relates to this, because it's about, what kind of ways can you really attract people to this new way of traveling? And I think, Martin, you also talked about like the subsidies that you're giving, for instance, to the public transit company to have free tickets, for instance, for the elderly. And one of the questions that was posed in the Q&A is, okay, you're giving subsidies to public transport providers, but shouldn't you also then think about giving subsidies to private mobility providers if you want them to operate in areas or operate for certain target groups? Are you thinking about things like that?
Yeah, well, at this moment, all those private companies come and they have a business plan. So the one thing that we're trying to think about, if you want this mobility shift also in the areas, then it's interesting to think about as a government, like a municipality, we can say, okay, we're not providing the elderly anymore. Maybe we do that for public transportation, but we do that for the sharing free bikes or scooters or small mobility. That's one of the options we could do by developing a whole new area. But at this moment, so that means because at this moment the areas are full of parking places because everybody's parking in front of their door because they have this right, they think. And maybe at this moment it is true, but if you don't have an alternative, so you say you take away the parking places, you provide this mobility hub, which is small, and you could get there your sharing car or your sharing bike, but you have to pay a lot. Then it's not so for the inhabitants. It's not so very interesting at this moment. So you need to rethink those options. And yeah, maybe it's good. We have several in Rotterdam who don't have a lot of money, but they also want to. Maybe you can subsidize them. Yeah, but we're not talking at this moment at now. I think that's
something
one
to
step.
see in future, but you're not doing it now. And how about you, Stijn?
No.
Well, we're currently working on developing. Wait, Nico, ik ben even aan het bellen. So in Antwerp, we're working on a rule-based incentives engine. I'm getting presents from my son. He came back from school. Super. Yeah. Sorry. That's what we're all doing it for, right? For our kids to give them a better future. But we're working on rules-based incentives back office to make it possible to, based on traveler characteristics, to give an incentive. And I try to push to make it mode independent, so that depending on the situation, on the time that, for example, the elderly can take public transport if they're capable of doing it and if they have access to it in their local area, or maybe get a taxi from that same budget and give that to that. Maybe that at that moment the private mobility provider is the best solution. So we're trying to define that to make it mode independent and really focused on the outcome of what you want to reach.
Yeah, so it's interesting. You're saying we're just giving budget to the target group, but we're not saying we're giving it to the company. It's for the person that's going to travel to see what he or she would like to use it for. That's
probably we'll end up with a mix, of course.
Yeah.
For some target groups, you need special vehicles that are not. Every bus should be accessible with a wheelchair, but that doesn't mean that every small car should be accessible with a wheelchair.
And a couple other points. One of them is that, and Stijn and Martin both mentioned pieces around this, but the idea of like, do you subsidize? The big question is this helping our overall community goals, right? Is this helping us get to either more sustainable or more equitable or like less congestion or whatever it is? And that's what's going to decide. Like, again, MaaS is not a goal. MaaS is one of many different pieces of solutions and what parts work best. So also, for instance, some things we're seeing in the U.S. is that some cities that have been really pushing, for instance, for scooters, to charge fees and all this, are starting to think, well, if scooters help us with our overall goals of reducing congestion, more equitable, more sustainable, then maybe instead of like charging them fees, we should be like helping subsidize them, right? So a big piece is it helping your overall goals? Now, a big question with that is how much does it? And that we really don't know yet, right? I mean, there's like early data on this, but we're still very early in the deployment of this. The second thing I wanted to say is that that question of do we subsidize? One thing I think that's really important, and I think Stijn is actually a lot of the work that I know you've done in Antwerp, I think is a great example of this, is money is not the only thing that is of value. Right, so there, like so much of what we've been seeing as we've worked with the public and private sector around MaaS and around new mobility issues, is that there's a ton of things that the public sector can be offering the private sector that is not cash. Alignment, validation, support, space sometimes, right? Those types of things. I'm actually in the. Sorry, there we go. In the chat, I just put a link to a report that we put together for the Knight Foundation. We're looking at equity issues, but one of the sections is all on tools and levers. I think it's chapter 3 or 4, something like that. And it just gives this large list of the different ways, and from the conversations that we've had from companies and from cities, that cities can really be helping. Sometimes it's just creating a forum, right, so that there can be this conversations or connections between the public and the private sector and communities. So I should they subsidize? Depends on the does it help with the end goal? And secondly, subsidies does not should they support should maybe be the bigger question, because subsidies is just one way of doing that.
If the only thing that the mobility provider asks for is subsidy, then you have the wrong mobility player, I think. It's about all the other things, and then you can figure things out and see target groups or certain areas. But of course, it's always finding that balance, because you don't want to give public money for free towards stakeholders, venture capitalists, without having certainties, without getting anything back. That is. But
so I'm going to cut you off, because we're almost at the end of our session, and we have so many things that we thought we would like to talk about, but the time is almost finished. So I'd actually like to do a last round among you, because we said we'd also like to make our discussion very practical. So I'd like to end with what your advice would be, like, if you're going to start with anything around policies and governance on new mobility and MaaS, what would your advice be to someone else? Where would you start? So I'll have you think a bit, and I'll just start with Nico.
Let the people think.
How about you let me think and have that? I'm the one who had to get up super early.
And in the meantime, just before you answer, I'm going to share another poll about how you like this session. We'd like to know. So before you leave, answer that poll. And we're going to do this last round of answering. So go ahead, Nico. I gave you just some seconds more.
Thank you. So I would say two things. The first thing that you really need to do is to do an assessment, like looking at those MaaS ingredients that we talked about, like figure out where are you at? I mean, so some people come out and say like, oh, we want MaaS, but if you don't have transportation options, right, what is it that you're creating, right? So really start out with an assessment of where you're at, what you have, what exists, and what is it you need, and then figure out what the role of governance should be. The second one is, no matter where you're at, developing trust is super important. So figuring out, having the conversations between the public sector and the private sector, developing having an open dialogue, helping facilitate conversations between private sector partners, helping facilitate conversations between private sector partners and the community. I think that will help you no matter where it ends up that you're at.
Thanks. Stijn.
Well, I would say trust and open discussions, and making clear that everybody has their own goals, but you have to try to align them. And there's nothing wrong with making profit in mobility. No problem with that, but we have our goals too. So I think that is key. I think another key aspect, well, make sure that you have a lot of political commitment to break a jar here and there, because new players are aggressive, but mostly don't do pilots, in the sense that for many of the things you have to roll out at such a scale that you cannot do a pilot. You have to go full in and learn by doing. But if you have had that open dialogue, if you have that open discussion, and it's clear for everybody that there will be steering and figuring things out on both ways, it works. You can do that, but rolling out 100 scooters in even in a small village like Antwerp, you will not learn anything from that. It's France. You have 1,000, 5,000 scooters there. You will learn something, and the companies will only make that investment if they have a longer-term commitment.
Great, Martin. What do you think about? What advice would you give?
I will say the first one, what Nico said is, look at what is your fundament of mobility as a service, then set clear goals, what you want to achieve and reach with a lot of people. 3, I think you should build a community. Start building communities that will join. And for example, big employments, all those people that will join to make the community big, and then you will make the change. This will be my advice.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank everybody for joining. If I look quickly at the poll, if you didn't fill it in, please do. People are quite satisfied. So thanks for being with us. And if you want to learn more about what Rotterdam is doing, I would advise you to go to session 2A. And that's the session of Martin Guit tomorrow. And if you would like to know more about, do we really need another new mobility pilot? Stijn was just connecting to that. That's a session that's organized by Nico's colleague, Becky Steckler, also tomorrow afternoon, 5A. So if you want to learn more about those topics, I would really recommend those sessions to you. And if you want to learn more about MaaS, there are several sessions about the MaaS responsive city, for instance, that then would also, I think, attract your attention. So thanks for being with us today. Thanks to the speakers.
Thank you guys for fantastic moderating.
Thanks for kicking off this conference and this first session round. And I hope to see everybody again tomorrow morning at 9:30. We start again. So thanks.
Thank you all.
All right,
Bye
thank
all.
you. Have a